All right, folks. Hi, folks. This is Dr. Surasingha again with landscape ecology, a second lecture. So in this lecture, we are going to talk about different applications of landscape ecology in broadly in the context of remote biodiversity surveys or passive biodiversity surveys, in other words. But remote biodiversity survey is an accurate or modern term that we used when we employ technology based applications or methods in surveying wildlife instead of physically visiting this area. So though these areas are done where scientists like us don't actually go into the field to actively look for animals. And these kind of methods are heavily dependent on computer science and recent developments in computer science, um, and to a certain extent application statistical applications. So there are many ways I could have covered this, but I think the best way to go delve into this is by use of existing projects that I'm a part of rather than presenting this conceptually, right? So I'm going to the rest of the lecture targeting these two themes are going to be based on a project that I actively engaged in. So this project, I will first give you the background, but as a starter, so this actually involved broadly sampling and decoding the entire soundscape in a particular habitat that we are interested in for multiple purposes, for a variety of purposes, and it's actually a local habitat, and we are for this project we are currently using or developing, I would rather say in the process of developing a deep learning model, a deep learning artificial intelligence system um, for the purpose of long-term monitoring of wildlife occupancy. And this particular tool, these kind of soundscape based tools have so many benefits. One of them is actually teaching education at formal settings as well as informal settings. So through this project we have actually even used soundscape to design or develop a new frontier in citizen sciences, so which actually is going to be pretty cool because these kind of applications are technically very advanced, right? It involves high-tech cutting edge computer coding, right? But an average person who doesn't even have any background in sciences, right, who's interested in nature can actually play a particular role in this major project. We will go through all of that. And I wanted to, before we go any further, I wanted to mention, if you look at the bottom part of the slide, this actually is a collaborative effort of multiple organizations, right? So MIT, particularly the Media Lab and the Responsive Environments Lab of Massachusetts Institute of Technology, one of the most, like the world's best institutes, academic institutes that develop new technology. Myself from Bridgewater State University, and Mass Audubon, state's largest, one of the biggest conservation-driven landowners in the state, and then a multi-institutional research organization called Living Observatory. So we actually have collectively played a role in designing this particular system. This presentation is something, actually it's a proceedings I presented at Wildlife Society's annual conference last year. All right, so let me give you a background. It's important to understand the biological background, ecological background behind a particular project. So you guys are all from Massachusetts and you are aware of what's happening with the cranberry farming industry within the state, or rather the entire industry within the region is actually, under decline. Right. Well, within the region, we are the biggest producers. There's a few farms in New Hampshire. Connecticut, Rhode Island has a fair, but in the region, or actually in the country, Massachusetts used to be one of the biggest cranberry producers. And so cranberry in the state largely happens in industrial scale. You have like farms that are over 100 acres in size, right? So cranberry is a wetland plant. They grow naturally, and cranberry itself is a native plant that is, pretty abundant in all over the region, and it's an iconic production, in the American culture, and an iconic commercial venture within the state, right? It was responsible for generating so much income, particularly back in the old days. So, and cranberry being a wetland plant, its growth or its cultivation happens largely in largely modified, heavily modified wetland systems. It could vary from a peat bog or to some sort of other peat-based wetland system. Those farms could be constructed by obstructing a flow of a free-flowing river and flooding the entire floodplain and altering the entire floodplain into a cranberry bog. So generally, the bottom line is cranberry bog farming at commercial scale. And then speaking of which, are there any non-commercial scale cranberry farming? No, there's no point of doing that, to be honest. So all of those cranberry farms that you see all over Massachusetts, right? They are based on heavily modifying an existing wetland system, right? And there are few cranberry bogs that were constructed on by modifying abandoned metal ores or metal mines, but the one that I'm going to talk to you about, this particular location located in Plymouth, the Tidmarsh Farms, is actually created by modifying a huge floodplain, right? So where is this location? I mean, you all are from southeastern Massachusetts or eastern Massachusetts for that matter. So the star over here, let me get my pointer. I always need my pointer. This is actually the study location, and you can see it's actually, a coastal freshwater system, right? And so this farming system, the Tidmarsh Farms, have been recently restored. I think it's about 2017, 2016, 2017 was the time frame when the restoration actually happened. And because of that restoration, we actually have, as you see in the bottom aerial imagery, a really interesting, very complex mixture of aquatic, upland, wetland habitat complex. So that kind of, we were trying to, through the restoration, our idea was to recreate a wetland complex that at least closely resembled the wetland system we have had before farming about 100 years ago. Right. Well, the question of whether are we actually replicating the exact land use here, the land cover history before farming is questionable because we have no data, 100 years back. So what we actually did over here is, rather than trying to recreate the history, which is actually questionable and could be extremely challenging and maybe unsuccessful for a variety of reasons, what we try to do is, we looked into the wetland landscape in the local region. We looked into the history a little bit, what kind of wetlands were more extensive in the coastal New England environments and what type are declining, what type are most suitable to regain wetland ecosystem functions, what type of wetlands are most suitable to support local wildlife and biodiversity. And based on that is actually how we came up with this particular design for the restoration. Okay. And by the way, if you have any questions about these kind of activities, do ask me. I am heavily involved in many aspects of this restoration project, and this does have a lot of educational and research opportunities coming up in future. So ultimate goal in this project is you have a highly homogeneous farming system that are heavily disturbed, heavily impacted, particularly not just with the physically, the farming machineries and farming operations. That's a lot of disturbance. Flooding these bogs periodically in every growing season or at the end of every growing season is massive amount of disturbances. Applications of fertilizers, pesticides also accentuates disturbances, right? So idea is to transfer that highly modified, highly disturbed, homogeneous system and convert that through ecologically informed, scientifically informed restoration activities, to convert that into a upland wetland aquatic habitat complex, right? So it's not just all wetlands, it's not just all wetland, it's actually a mosaic of all the three habitats, which actually increases the overall diversity, increases the overall ecosystem functions. And what you are looking at, that particular image to the right over here, is actually the stream channel that we created through the process of restoration, right? Early it was just a straightforward ditch, right, that actually channeled the water through the farm, but now it's actually a beautiful stream that meanders through the floodplain. So just to give you an idea how much change happened, right, because of the restoration, first look at this particular Google imagery coming from November 2019. Right, you can see the farmed bogs all over here, and you can see the perimeter ditches, right, and some of the retention ponds here and there, right, and here's some retention ponds over here as well, right, and you can see this irrigation canals, right, and slightly you can see the perimeter ditches. So you can see how homogeneous that particular habitat is, and also pay attention to these channels that deliver water into the system. These are actually channelized river flow, right? This used to be a natural river that actually meandered through the property, but you can see how how simplified the channel is, and how straight the actual channel really is, right? And some of this holding reservoir that you can see somewhere around here, right, is actually used to be a headwater system, right? And this is also a headwater system. This used to be a headwater system, right? And the last point, this is the largest the water source for the entire farm, right? This is a small water source, this is a small water source, right? But this is the largest headwater system that supplies water to this particular habitat, right? And this is actually not a constructed pond. You might guess it is because of its weird shape. It is not. It's actually an old glacial lake. So this is actually what the Tidmarsh farms looks like today after restoration, right? We have removed all of that separate cranberry bogs. The ditches have almost disappeared. There's some remnants of the irrigation canals and ditches, but if you look at an aerial photograph today, this is coming from 2018. If you look at an aerial photograph today, you actually do not see any remnants of the old ditch systems, and you can see how much we have changed the stream channel. It's completely meandering, right? And we have actually taken away dams, so headwater systems are regaining its historical appearance. We are creating new sequences and arrays of lentic habitats all over the property, right? And so largely, what used to be a floodplain now is again a floodplain, right? And we actually just didn't make it an entirely a floodplain. We created a diverse array of other wetland systems. Again, I'm not going to go into all of that detail. I'm in the process of giving you just the basic background you need to understand the soundscape element of it. So before restoration, you are looking at something like this, right? Very homogeneous bog systems, right? With just one plant, a monoculture plant, that is cranberry. And if there is anything else invading, the farmers used to remove it. But now what we did was you completely transformed that into a highly heterogeneous, diversity-rich shrub scrub system, right? And look at the stream channel that is straight, it's channelized. You can see the channel has no habitat heterogeneity, right? And it has a sandy bottom. But this is what the exactly same location looks like today, right? And not only it has actually growing vegetation inside the stream system, we have lots of woody debris, we have a stream's bed heterogeneity, the flooding is happening again, right? So we are actually recreating lots of ecosystem functions and ecosystem structures. So those were the dams that we used to have that actually created these holding reservoirs to flood the bogs for harvesting purposes, and we removed them, right? And so thus we actually recreated the flow through river systems and the headwater, the peat-rich headwater bogs, which are very unique ecosystems. Now to the actual soundscape project that I'm trying to focus on. So let me explain the overall structure of this soundscape system. In fact, the network, the sensory network I'm going to describe you is a lot broader than simply soundscape, right? So rather than just depending on one variable, which is actually the soundscape, we actually sample from a variety of other parameters where we try to sense many other environmental elements or structures or processes in the environment to get a better idea about what's going on in this landscape. So what is the overall idea here? Well, we restored over 400 acres of farmlands, right, into a wetland complex. So it's a huge property, and we are interested in figuring out what kind of wildlife is occupying this area. Number one. Number two, in terms of biochemical environment, how does this particular heavily impacted, polluted, agrochemically polluted bog has recuperated after restoration, right? So, and so there are these two parts, right? Biological responses to restoration, right? How much wildlife are we recruiting to these new habitats? Two, the biochemical aspect, or rather physical and chemical aspect, where we are trying to understand how well have we mitigated adverse impacts of agriculture and agricultural legacy through restoration. So there are two questions we are trying to answer, right? So that's why we actually are using a huge like a network of sensory systems to sample the landscape and try to understand how restoration had helped to recuperate from the farming legacies. So let's go one by one and understand what's going on over here. Let's start over here. We have over 300 sensors already deployed in the field, and we're trying to increase this number of sensors as this network solidifies. So these sensors, these 300 sensors are actually more rather monitoring the weather and the climate. So we monitor temperature, humidity, air pressure, atmospheric pressure, right, light intensity, infrared radiation, uh, ultraviolet radiation, and soil moisture, because those are extremely important, biologically important physical and chemical parameters, right? So we actually measure them, and then let's go to this particular node, right? Over nearly 400,000 of bird call records, right? So the system was deployed in 2016, and when I was actually reviewing the data 2019, we actually had nearly like 400,000 events where we documented bird calls, right? So now these events included, two types. One, the most of those out of those 400,000 records of bird events or bird presence validations are actually coming from the soundscape detection, right? So those soundscape detection includes microphones, right? And those microphones, as you can see over here, they actually detect, in terms of birds, over 400,000 in combination with some video detection, right? So the video component is actually coupled with the audio component or the acoustic component, right? What we have over there is actually a these video cameras deployed in the field. We only have about 15 of them, right? Actually, sorry, my bad. We only have about 6 of them, right? And we have about 24 microphones, about 6 cameras. So that's why we have a lot more sound recording and fewer video recording. So these are actually live transmitting. This and the mics, they're actually live in the field right now, right? And they are the videos are actually 24/7 activated. The acoustic systems as well are 24/7 activated. They are not just motion triggered, they are not just sound triggered, they record anything and everything. The reason we actually have deployed that kind of a like a seamless data collection is that we don't want to miss anything. The problem with sound triggered or motion triggered recording systems is that some of those could get false triggering, right, and then kind of creates false data. Two, some of the triggerings, like sound triggerings, may be so low in terms of the amplitude or the pitch, so the soundscape system may not be triggered by like low amplitude, low energy sound signals. So that's why actually we created detection sensors, microphones and cameras that actually that are seamlessly collecting data, right? So if we have the data later on, we can actually engineer our software to pick up very low amplitude, low pitch signals. So that's actually the whole idea of seamless data collection. And so these are deployed in vivo, meaning they're actually in the situation, right in the field, right, and collecting data as we speak, right. Now it's actually collecting data for the 4th year, and will hopefully continue on. And then we'll come over here. So yeah, like because of these cameras, we actually have a lot of wildlife recording, right? We mean documented presence of wildlife on the property, right? And collectively, the documentation of wildlife activity is actually relatively low, about 112 hours, because we don't have a whole lot of cameras, and probably we would like to include more cameras, so we will have a longer hours of detection. And then collectively, out of all of those detection systems, the soundscape and the videoscape, right, we actually have traced about 37 species through acoustic systems, 37 species of birds through acoustic systems, and about 12 different mammal species identified through the video frames or the videographs. And in fact, these counts have slightly increased in the recent. I cannot remember the actual updates right now, but we have a very high levels of detection. And think about the fact that this is a brand new algorithm, right? I know we have more than 37 birds in southeastern Massachusetts, but think about the fact that this is a wetland system, and think about the fact that the soundscape system we created is brand new, just 3 years old. It's analogous to a 3-year-old kid, right? That is actually learning everything from the scratch, right? And mostly teaching itself. And moving on, so other than biological sounds, right, which includes, I mentioned mammals and birds earlier, we also are capable of detecting insect sounds, amphibian calls, right? And I have been involved in actually decoding the amphibian signals and trying to train this artificial intelligence system, the deep learning system, to become better at amphibian identification. So in total, we actually have recognized about 66 different classes of acoustic signatures that represents overwhelmingly biological signals, and to a certain degree certain geophonic and anthrophonic signals. Those includes like motor vehicles, we can detect them, and we can also detect storms, thunder, wind, right? So we actually are able to detect a wide range of acoustic signals that are arising from this environment. So far we haven't thought of including, we have thought of including, but we haven't included an ultrasonic component, right? It's something that we will actually incorporate in future. The technology in terms of decoding that and collecting that data requires completely different thought process and an engineering infrastructure. So that's actually kind of what delays it. So that's actually the basics of it. As you can see, right, it's not just soundscape, right? We juxtapose our soundscape data, which actually collectively represents the most of the data that we collect comes from the soundscape aspect, but we juxtapose that with biophysical data, biochemical data, and vision-based data, right? So you might have already heard about this trail cams you can use passively to monitor wildlife. So we actually went a step beyond that, right? We are actually collecting seamless videos of wildlife presence. All right, let's move on, right? So what is deep learning? Well, deep learning is the artificial intelligence system that we have created, right? Actually explaining what deep learning is and breaking it down into the nitty-gritty details actually, will require me to teach you a different class on artificial intelligence. So I will explain this system a little bit in detail as we go forward, right? So that deep learning is one of the most advanced currently available algorithm classes that collectively belongs to artificial intelligence, right? And speaking of artificial intelligence, do you think those, the phones that you use, Siri, Cortana, Amazon, or whatever the thing that Amazon produced, I can't remember her name. Those are actually not really artificial intelligence, right? Those are called assisted intelligence that are actually subpar to actual artificial intelligence, right? All of those things, Siri, blah blah blah, all of those phone-based or computer-based voices are actually helping you to search stuff, look things up. They are helping you to Google things, right? So they assist you with search algorithms, right? They themselves are not capable of data processing, right? They're simply capable of recognizing your voice and taking your commands and commands of like just simple commands like doing a search, right? Booking your calendar, or helping you to navigate, right? If you're on the road. So those are again, like they're incorrectly referred to as AIs or artificial intelligence. They're not. They're called in computer sciences assisted intelligence, right? So this system actually is advanced to what you have in your phone, right? This thing is actually smart and it performs extremely detailed analysis. Right, let's move on. Right. So idea over here that what our overall idea is to understand post restoration monitoring, right? So the biological or ecological transformation of ecosystem functions and ecosystem structure, habitat structure, and habitat processes are quite rapid, particularly in the early phase of restoration. Things happen extremely fast, right? So physical manual surveys may not be effective in detecting any of these, right? Because it happens, at such a shorter time frame, and our entire property is too large, right? Over 400 acres. Actually, it's nearly 600 acres if you include the terrestrial part. So, logistically hard, too time consuming, too labor intensive, right? People are not cheap. People are expensive, right? So that's actually why we resorted to this system that will actually, collect seamless data, right, from the entire property. And also I want to mention another fact, ecologically related fact. The biggest problem, as scientists we encounter when we do survey is that certain animals are active only during a very narrow window of a time, right? Best example is, this northern leopard frog, which is, fairly commonly distributed throughout the northeastern environment, right? Or mid-Atlantic to northeastern environment. But its activities are limited to like very early in the morning. It's after midnight to probably right before dawn, right? So it has a very limited, very restricted activity pattern. Another endangered species that we study that is endangered in Massachusetts is eastern spadefoot toad, right? Like its activity is limited to something between 1 a.m. to 3 a.m. or 1 a.m. to 2 a.m. right? It's calling its biology, is limited to that particular time frame. To make it worse, these certain amphibians that are especially pond breeding amphibians that lay eggs in temporary wetland systems, their above ground activities could be limited to sometimes couple of weeks, right, in the spring season, right? Sometimes just a month. If you look at wood frogs, their activities are concentrated in like early winter month, or couple of months at most, and then they actually retreat to underground burrows, or they go into forests, right? So the bottom line is, like many species we study, right? Mammals, largely amphibians and reptiles, lesser degree to mammals and birds. Their activities, A, could be restricted to a particular season in a calendar year, right? It could be a few weeks to a month, right? As short as that. B, their activities could be divided into different habitats, right? So you have to actually follow and survey different habitats in order to understand their biology. But if you're only interested in a particular habitat and the species occupying that particular habitat, you have to extensively survey the entire calendar year, because different species are active in different time frames. There is a temporal niche partitioning in animal activities, right? You cannot, it is extremely hard to extend your survey efforts temporally and spatially to capture all of these different wildlife activities, particularly if you're interested in more than one taxa like myself. If you're a community ecologist studying different species, it's impossible to be in the field 24/7, right? So that is actually why these kind of automated sensory systems that are reinforced by artificial intelligence are extremely helpful to make data collection seamless, right? Temporally and spatially. So, rapid biodiversity assessments, that's a new word for you. Rapid biodiversity assessment is actually collecting data on different taxa, different types of biodiversity in an extremely short window, right? For example, in this project, we were interested in understanding or creating a baseline for biodiversity immediately after restoration, right? Immediately after restoration. So you don't have a long window, right? You have like one season, and just that season to collect data to understand what is the baseline immediately after restoration, right? And you can think about that before the restoration. When restoration is planned, when everything is scheduled, you might only have such a short window to collect data before restoration, before the actual groundbreaking happens, right? So, or there could be another wetland, right, that a private entrepreneur is attempting to develop, right, and make a shopping mall, or make a, I don't know, parking lot or an airport. So when a developer proposes something like that, the government has to evaluate it, right? So government cannot collect data from a short window, right, to decide whether the development can be permitted or not, right? So in order to govern, these kind of development activities and to understand what habitats should receive conservation, right, rapid biodiversity assessments can help a lot, right? If you look at a conservation agency, a private conservation organization, right, like Mass Audubon, for example, right, they are in the process of buying lands to protect biodiversity. They need to know what habitats require more protection, right? And they have so much limited money, so you cannot invest in every piece of land. So they have to prioritize. How do they prioritize? By understanding what type of biodiversity exists in certain landscapes. So these kind of automated biodiversity monitoring systems can help making decisions on development by governmental agencies, making decisions where to invest on conservation by private land trusts, private conservation organizations, or by the government themselves. So automated systems can collect data seamlessly across time, across space, right? And with the involvement of high-end artificial intelligence systems, you can accurately and continuously detect wildlife activities. That's one. Store that data somewhere, so it is available infinitely, and then analyze it and ID what kind of species, what kind of taxa you find, right? So identification has a taxonomic resolution, right? At best, you can actually identify up to individual level, right? Which is extremely hard, right? Relatively feasible level is identifying up to species, right? In certain cases, you can actually identify up to what, like genus, order, or family, right? But at Identifying at lower taxonomic resolution may not be very productive or useful, so species level is the best, right? And it is the most useful, and that's what we are trying to get towards. And then you can actually, in this system, in our system, we can even geolocate. Meaning what? Where does exactly each sound signature comes from, right? So we can understand the spatial patterns of animal activities. And also gaining a higher resolution of all of data points in terms of spatial resolution, like, meaning what? Like if we can understand every spatial unit in the landscape, right? If we can interpret the biological activities in 1 foot by 1 foot spatial area, that is better than getting data just from 1 meter by 1 meter. That is better than getting the same thing out of 1 kilometer, right? So higher the resolution of data collection, the better it is, right? Our system actually strives for higher spatial resolution, right? We are trying to strive for to collect data from the smallest possible unit in the landscape, right? And high resolution in terms of time, right? Can we actually break it down to for data coming from every minute is better than just looking at every hour, right? So you can actually even break it down to the highest resolution in terms of the time scale, right? So what are the benefits of this? Because of this seamless data collection, seamless data storage, geolocation, and higher resolution from all the aspects. And another resolution is, think about the spectral resolution, right? Soundscape, right? The sound signals comes from electromagnetic. It's part of the electromagnetic spectrum, right? So if we can detect all the form of sounds, right, all the form of acoustic signatures from the every tiny bit of nanometer in that wavelength, that's actually better than actually going for a broader bands, right? Detecting each narrow band of sound signatures is better than detecting a broader band. So it's important to understand all these aspects of resolution, right? High spatial resolution, high temporal resolution, and high spectral resolution, right? Because of all of that reasons, we are able to detect rare species, right, in these habitats. Actually, we have detected several rare species of birds with our soundscape system. Northern harrier, for instance, is one of the state endangered or state threatened species that we detected. There are a couple of other species bird species. I cannot recall them exactly right now, but we do have them detected. And species that actually have a very low occurrence rates, right, that are harder to detect through conventional surveys. For example, mammals fall into these categories, right? River otters, they are not a rare species, but they actually occur in very low abundance, throughout North America. But in newly restored habitats, it's hard to detect them. The actual visual observations of this animal is limited to a handful of detections, right? I only have seen them once in my own eyes. I have been in this property pretty much every day of the week, right? So we actually can detect those species that are like hard to find or have a very low occurrence rate in the property, in this landscape. So it can actually correct for impaired detection by the human eye, right? And since actually we sample not only the biological sounds, we sample the geophony and the anthrophony, we can use this kind of a sound system to detect all the concepts in the soundscape that I explained to you in the previous lecture, right? Since we have microphones distributed throughout the soundscape, right? And some of those microphones are actually omnidirectional, and some of those microphones are unidirectional. So some microphones collect data from a particular narrow spatial area, right? And some microphones actually collect data from a radius, right? So in that way, by combining these two, right, we can actually sample a greater radii around us or a specific location at a greater length, right? So we actually so that enhances our detection. And then we have the ability to geolocate the source of each sound signature. So our system is spatially explicit, meaning we can very pinpoint way we can say that where a particular sound signature came from at what time, right? Temporal variations in biophony. Since we collect data seamlessly, right? It's 24/7, right? We will not miss a single time window, right? And our temporal resolution is very high. So we can detect things up to half a second, right? Up to half a second, right? If a particular sound signature is emitted just for a half a second, we can detect it, right? That's what it means, right? So right now, we actually have detections of nearly 50 species of birds, different insects, right? Cicadas, crickets, springs. So in terms of biophony, I know that we earlier mentioned we detect so many, like over 60, about 66 different acoustic classes. But our AI, as a young child, is not good at accurately identifying everything it collects, but it's extremely good at it. We have over 90% accuracy, at actually over 95% of accuracy in certain cases, like 98 to 99% of accuracy in detecting cicada calls, cricket calls, spring peepers. It's extremely good at detecting spring peepers, and green frogs have been extremely good at detecting, accurate at correctly identifying over 40 species of birds, right? um And in fact, these microphones that I'm talking to you about, are actually custom made, right? Meaning what? We didn't actually buy it off the shelf. To be honest with you guys, none of these devices that we have deployed in the field are off the shelf, right? It's not like you going to the Radio Shack and buying things, right? No, we actually designed every piece of equipment by ourselves, right? Only thing we don't do is we don't make them. We design it, right, on the paper and on the computer, and then we send the design template to a private company, right, and that particular company designs produce everything for us, right? MIT did actually create some of those as a prototype, right? For the purpose of testing out, we actually produced even the actual thing and tested it out, but we don't have time or the capacity within the MIT to mass produce these things in the quantity we want. Actually, it's a little bit more expensive for us to produce them from the scratch rather than working with a company. And the other thing is we actually have industrial partners through MIT that actually will produce this with us to to a very low cost. So most of the so how do we actually the biggest question, right, is actually, okay, we have all of those recording systems, right? And how good are we at how are we going to actually train the AI, right? There are so many different ways to train an AI, right? At one end, you have a completely supervised training systems where um, the AI at the beginning is capable of doing nothing, but you actually feed it known data with known species identifications of sound signatures collected from different environments of different species, multiple records of same species, and then you feed it, right, to the AI with an identification annotation, right? This particular sound signature, well, that's actually species A. This particular sound signature is species B. This particular sound signature, species C. Like that, you actually feed it, different files of sound, right? And then the algorithm you created in the AI, is designed to identify, is designed to actually not just listen to that particular sound, but it actually graphically looks at the soundscape signature, right? Remember in the previous lecture I showed you the sonogram, right? They actually, what the AI does is actually, look at that sonogram. For the AI, it's not actually a sound signal that it hears. It's actually a picture that it tries to analyze, right? In terms of, all the qualities of a sound signature. Remember the parameters of a sound signal: frequency, amplitude, um, wavelength, right, and the energy of the soundscape, right? And those are the four critical parameters of a soundscape. So And the AI actually plots these sonograms and then try to interpret the sonograms by breaking into smaller components and try to understand the repeatability of the patterns, right? Reoccurrence of these patterns, the uniqueness in these signatures, and then try to connect that with the species ID, right? So that's actually very basically how an AI works, right? It looks at the data, right, and tries to understand the different patterns of the data in terms of uniqueness and repeatability, right, and then try to link the species identification with those uniquenesses in that particular signature. So it's an extremely complicated analytical process, right? So our system, right, well, before our system, so at one end is completely training, right? It's kind of teaching you guys to understand amphibian calls based on sounds, which actually I did with a couple of students previously. Now, the other end is actually a completely unsupervised system where you just feed unidentified sound signals, sound files to the AI, and the AI itself goes through these sound signals over and over and over until it is able to classify these sound files based on the uniquenesses of each sonogram. What we did is actually a hybrid of those two ends. We call it semi-automated, semi-supervised system. Why? Because we actually have collected data, right? First, within the site, within this location from Tidmarsh, right? And so we call them ambient sound. Because they are locally collected by sampling the entire atmosphere for sounds, right? And the microphones are actually collecting information through this whatever the sound that propagates through the sound. You can collect data by actually attaching a microphone to the ground auto substrate, right, or deploying it in water. We haven't done that yet, right, because those things will actually add a lot of background noise, right? So it's extremely complicated to decode the soundscape that propagate through solids or liquids. Relatively easy to do that for the atmospheric sounds. Two, we actually collected data off-sites, right? We collected some data from Cornell Lab of Ornithology. We also worked with several zoos, right, and collected data from those locations, and we also collected data from people's backyards, right, and use all of those for the purpose of training our AI, right? So all of those sounds, we have a species identification, right, and sometimes certain sound signals have multiple species. Some of them only have one species, right? And in certain cases, the multiple species overlap when they emit their calls, and some of them they don't overlap, right? In certain sound files, they actually has a lot of background noise, right? And in certain sound files, there's less background noise, right? So we actually have this a diverse set of sound files that have varying levels of complexity, right? And use those annotated sound files to actually train this AI, right? Our deep learning system. And we actually we have a name for him, right? Tidzam. So that's actually how the training happened, right? So that's why it is semi-supervised. So why it is semi-supervised if you're actually training it? Well, it is semi-supervised is because after initial training, right, we actually stopped feeding it with trained data, annotated data. We actually then start feeding it with local ambient data, right, just collected from Tidmarsh, and write its script to use the basic training to classify new data. The new data we feed it, we call it test data, right? So the AI system will now classify the test data, and then we structure the AI system to feed back the filtered test data again, so that the AI system can learn from its own mistake, right? And also what we have done is actually this test data that goes through the AI system also go through a human interface, right? And I think there's another slide coming up to explain that part. So the human interface is actually someone like you and me, a specialist of birds, specialist of amphibians, specialist of soundscapes, will listen to each sound signature one at a time and annotate what's over there. And that human identified, human validated data goes back through the AI system, and the AI system now learns from the human, right, and try to correct itself, right? Ultimately, our goal is actually with this level of human assisted training and expert training, the system actually will eventually perform better than a human, right? Because it has its own analytical capacity and it is learning from what people do. I don't know how long it will take for that to happen, but it's not impossible for that to happen. Database augmentation, that actually means that every time we actually collect correctly ID'd data, right, with verified by multiple experts, human experts, we add that on to the basic training data, right, and feed it again to the AI system. So there is a continuous augmentation of training data, right? And it is semi-automated because it's the system, we once we actually have all the data, test data and training data, right, we have programmed in a such a way for these things to happen automatically, right? We don't have to have a human actually kind of governing everything. All we have to do is check whether things are flowing smoothly once in a while. And so this is the interesting part, right? So some of the local ambient data we collect from Tidmarsh that are unknown, untagged, right? It goes through a web-based platform, a very user-friendly web-based interface. Different human users, experts, can actually tag them, right? They can actually listen to a particular sound file and tag every species, right? They can identify, right? If they can just ignore that, right? And that since that is actually open, that right now is open in two avenues. One is, like if we know an expert, right, hands down we know that person is an expert, we actually let them directly use that interface, right? And whatever that particular identification that expert does, we actually accept it because that would be someone who's a veteran in that particular field. The second part actually goes to any citizen, right, who is not an expert. So those non-expert has to undergo some basic training, and then we actually do some very rigorous training to those novices, and then we actually give them a little test, multiple tests to see how good they are, and then we actually use their identification annotation for the training purpose as well. And in fact, the AI knows, whose data is more reliable than the other, right? So when AI goes through its own training, it will rely more on our experts' data and less on citizens' data, right? So the bottom line is, because of this crowdsourcing part, that actually led to evolution of a citizen science element, right? Where we can actually even include, like anyone interested in nature to play through our sound files, learn from us, right? And use our data as a teaching source, and particularly those who are interested in teaching and public outreach. This particular platform is for you, right? To train by yourself, to train people that you work with, to train your students in your classroom. So particularly this is for the graduate students who are teachers, or undergrads who are going to be teachers or working in public outreach. Do talk to me if you are interested in using the system for your job right now or in future, right? This is available free of charge, right? So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the live and audio capture, right? So we actually have 24+3 custom made omnidirectional mics, like I mentioned earlier. So I did mention about this 24:3 microphone arrangement. So we have 24 omnidirectional mics and 3 unidirectional mics, and all of them are custom made. And the audio channels that we have are actually synchronized, meaning the channels keep collecting and recording data at the same time from all the locations. And then the data that we collect is compressed, so we don't have a problem with transmission of the data or storage of the data, right? Synchronizing multiple audio channels at the same time that actually work both omnidirectionally and unidirectionally is actually extremely difficult. Like most of the existing commercial systems, right, struggle with this synchronized data transfer or synchronized data collection, right, let alone transfer part. But with our system, we actually were able to overcome the synchronization problem, transmission problem, because actually compression helps with the transmission and storage. And then in order to transmit from the site of collection to the side of storage, we use two systems. We piggyback on both. So we have partly a Wi-Fi capability, right? So the data that we collect, as soundscapes, are actually kind of converted to Wi-Fi format and then transmitted from those collection devices, from those sensors, to a central computer that is located, like centrally located in Tidmarsh property. And then from that particular unit, through internet, it goes back to, like with a strengthened signal, it goes back to through regular internet systems to the MIT servers, right? And then we also used, in order to safeguard, like kind of experimentally, we used optic cables, right? We knew the fiber optic cables will work. That is the best damn thing to transmit data, right? I mean, I know it's not very, like it's not very modern. Fiber optic cables existed for, like, I don't know, for a very long time. I can't remember exactly when, but it is nothing innovative. But unfortunately, the Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, other wireless transmission systems are not as good as fiber optics, guys, right? So we try to experiment the Wi-Fi system in the outdoor environment. It's spotty. Like we are still challenged with that, but fiber optic system works. Sometimes even when you use modern technology, you cannot let go the old school tech go, disappear, right? The only problem with Wi-Fi, fiber optics, is if a rat starts or a raccoon starts biting our cables. But you can actually foolproof that. There are many ways to overcome those other logistics. It's harder to make Wi-Fi or Bluetooth based transmissions better. And ultimately, yeah, everything that's collected locally, from a local computer, is transmitted um, to the MIT server, right? So in terms of powering, all of those stations actually have a battery power, right? But we also, recharge the battery with solar, right? We have a solar panel at every station, that every sensor station, to trigger the power needs of everything else, right? These are very high power systems, right? And we don't want to be environmentally unfriendly by piggybacking on the national grid. So that's actually why we thought about kind of harnessing the solar power. And this is an open system. It's a open wetland, right? Open green space. So canopy impedance is not a big problem for us, right? So we are able to overcome that as well. In winter, we slightly have a problem with a snowstorm. These systems has to be physically cleaned up. But other than that, actually, we are doing fine. In terms of data sampling, the temporal resolution is actually 0.5 seconds. So 500 milliseconds is the smallest unit that we can detect in our system, right? And those windows, the 500 millisecond windows, overlaps 50%. So two consecutive 500 millisecond windows overlap for about 250 milliseconds, right? So that actually ensures the seamless nature of the data collection, right? So we are not missing anything, right? Even some sort of a weirdness happens inside the system, inside the hardware, right? There's a 250 millisecond time frame for things to kick back, right? So we are not missing anything. Okay. And we are using different spectrogram types that actually provide the best details with the highest possible spectral resolution, and that's what Mel-Felter-Banks spectrogram system is. I'm not going to go into detail about that. All you need to know is it's actually higher in spectral resolution. It can split your entire spectrogram, soundscape signal, acoustic signal, into many small channels, right? So it has a fine-tuning capacity to tease apart very small sound signals. And then it goes through filter systems, right? A series of filter systems, because you have to now filter out different signatures, and then it goes to a normalization process before it is going to the actual classifier, right? A normalization is required because there's an ambient sound, right? So you need to actually kind of normalize or kind of standardize every data point in the context of that particular ambient environment. That's why normalization is important, right? And after normalization, after you standardize your data collected for that particular context, then it feeds into the actual classification, where you end up identifying at a very coarser scale as biophonic, geophonic, and anthrophonic, and then even further going into identifying different species or different classes of anthrophony and different classes of geophony. And the actual deep learning system, the deep learning is a class of AIs, right? The specific class we are trying to use, or we are actually in the process of working on with great success, is convolutional neural networks, right? Piggybacked with expert-based classification, because there is the training component comes with expert identified, expert annotated data, right? So again, like I mentioned, teaching you what a convolutional neural network requires me like half of a class, right? So I'm actually going to very basically tell you what that is, right? So your brain is actually, a network of neurons, right? And some other secondary cells. Your neurons, and those neuron junctions, synapses collectively, are responsible for storage of data, right? Information that you gather from all your senses, right? Eyes and your ears, and many other sensory systems, and to interpret that, right? There are specific neurons. Certain neurons are specialized in transmitting, data from your sensory systems to your central nervous system. And in the central nervous system, there are several subdivisions within the brain, the midbrain, forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain. There's a division of labor where are certain neural clusters have evolved to decode certain signals. Some parts visual signals, some parts auditory signals, some parts chemical signals. A convolutional neural network does exactly the same, at least at a basic analogous level. That's what it does, right? Certain neural pathways in the network are designed to transmit signals, right? And certain parts are to analyze, right? Certain parts are to analyze certain spectral signatures that are characterized by amplitude. Certain parts are better at analyzing or understanding, decoding signals coming with certain bandwidths, right? Like that, there's a division of labor for different acoustic characteristics, that are better at the process of identification, right? And then actually it goes through different processing centers. It goes through different layers of neural network, right? One at a time, because certain layers of neural network are better at decoding the soundscape than the other, right? So the more layers you use, the greater the accuracy of the identification, right? So there are multiple layers of acoustic scene classification. Simply, the acoustic signature data you collect becomes a spectrogram. So that's what an acoustic scene is, and that acoustic scene undergoes multiple layers of neural networks or neural layers, computer generated neural layers, and will ultimately shoot at a particular species. And when you actually get an output, this particular acoustic signature belongs to that species, you also get an estimation of the certainty, right? And so that's what I meant by the ambiguity metric, right? The AI will tell you how certain that particular, the deep learning system is for this particular identification tag, right? And in fact, what is the advantage of that is actually now we can look at what kind of sound signatures it's poor at identification, right? What kind of signals are misinterpreted, right? Are there any false detection, right, that we are seeing? Or are there any instances where it is not detecting anything, right? So this ambiguity metric helps us to remodify the scripts or the coding system of the convolutional neural network, and try to add more training data or more annotated data, right? Or re-annotate those, like poorly ID'd data. So the neural network ultimately becomes better. The deep learning systems, can evolve further. So that's actually why we call this convolutional, because there is kind of a a recurrent system where the same data set, actually is feed multiple times over and over and over. So the ambiguity matrix actually goes down when you expose the same network into multiple when the same neural network is exposed to the same sound signature over and over and over, the system gets better because this particular deep learning system is designed to self-evolve, right? And yes, of course, we do substantial amount of self-coding and self-modification from season to season. In fact, that kind of training happens once in every 2 months, right? And that helps to increase the accuracy. Yes, our AI can teach itself. It's designed for that particular purpose, but we cannot completely automate it. We are not, none of the AI systems that are working so well are 100% self-trained. So we do believe that human intervention is required. So the experts are never going to go away. So generally, I did mention that so far we have about between 60 to 70 acoustic classes, over 400,000 soundscape files, right? Each 500 milliseconds long. So the convolutional, I can never pronounce this word, convolutional neural network performs a self-extraction of hierarchical feature representations that describe the spectral content associated with qualitatively different types of acoustic signatures, right? So specific classifiers that we have here are non-exclusive classes, right? So it's like bird calling with the wind, right? So those are non-exclusive. It has birds and wind. And then we actually have areas where we have no wind but with bird calling or animals calling, right? Animals or amphibian calling with rain and without rain, right? So that we actually have, a diverse range of classes in our system, right? Because sounds do not arise, on its own. It's not isolated. It's always embedded in the other elements, right? So it's extremely important that our neural network, our deep learning system, can declassify these complex data points. Righty. Now that's actually what DITSAM is about. That is the overall multi-sensor AI system that collects, stores, interprets, and analyzes sounds, right? So let me now talk a little bit about the actual graphic user interface, web-based graphic user interface that is so user-friendly. Any human being, any chimp that is trained to handle a computer or internet can use this particular system to train themselves for teach others, right? So this is a great citizen science platform that we are trying to encourage people to use in future, right? So DITPlay, this citizen science interface, web-based interface, is free of charge, right? It's free for anyone. Anyone with internet access will have this, right? You do not require any installation. All you have to have is an internet connection, and I think in terms of browsers, it works best with Chrome, right? It does work with other web platforms, but go with Chrome. Chrome is better in general. So there are two user bases. There are like trained scientists, wildlife ecologists, right? And so those scientists, what they do is actually they mine data from our stored data set, right, for a variety of purposes. Maybe they're actually designing their own AIs, right, or they're using it for teaching and training purposes, right, or they're actually doing that for annotating our database and helping us to identify what soundscape we collect, right? And then we have on the other hand, we actually have like non-scientists, right, where they actually, can undergo trainings, self-paced, self-taught training with our data, right? And actually our AI is involved in this teaching purpose. The AI will actually train. Now the trained AI that we have created will train citizens, right, in terms of properly identifying certain sound signals. And also the AI will actually test you, right, how good you are at after training. In fact, the AI is trying to get better at training citizens, right? So the training modules or the tutorial modules that our AI uses will also become modified, right, with different users. If certain citizens are already well equipped for learning, right, our AI will pick up, aha, this guy is actually a big deal, right? He knows what he's talking about. So we invest, so the AI invests little energy on training like citizens that are well experienced. And if we have a new, like a student, like a high school student, right, or a kindergartner, then of course they will spend longer time training that kindergartner, right? So because of this interface, it can be used for different types of public engagement to attract people um to become nature goers, right? So in this case, you don't actually, let's say that it's a bad weather day, right? Or you are having a bad knee, or you are injured, but you love going out to the nature. We can bring the nature to you. Open up your laptop, log on to our website, right, Tidzam, and simply start playing sounds, right? It's as simple as that. um and this will be a very good way to do public outreach, right? Particularly in this time of the in this weird time, right, where we cannot engage in the field, where we cannot interact with people. This is a good way to do the same thing, right? All you need is everybody to log on, right, virtually communicate with other people and just do your thing from your home. You don't have to even leave your home to do this, right? An excellent educational tool, right? We have 400,000 data files that you can use, right? We have annotated data, unannotated data. So you can actually design any educational activity with all of these, right? And if you actually were in the nature, right, in Tidmarsh or anywhere else, if you were to record any sound, we welcome you to upload those sounds to our Tidzam system, right? And also, any data we record are free for you to download, free for you to share, right? So it's actually, things go always, right? So any annotation you guys do on your own with your student or with the people that you work with, we will use that annotation to train our AI, right? We will use that annotation to train other citizen scientists. So your engagement over here goes beyond just you having fun or you enjoying it, right? Your engagement will go a long way. That's what I wanted to say. So just to put everything together here, the Tidzam recordings, the recording we do with our AI system, right, will undergo expert identification, and expert scientists will annotate data files, right? And that will then be used to train our AI or to create a local annotated acoustic database specifically for Tidmarsh, right? And use that annotated data set to train our AI as training data, right? And then use that training data to iteratively, repeatedly to drive classification systems, right? So that the classifiers, that self-evolving classifiers in our AI, actually with repeated iterative exposure, will become better at identifying certain things. As a result, the ambiguity signature will actually keep going down with repeated training, right? And in fact, the training dataset we create, right, can be used for training other AIs that have been used elsewhere, right? So we are actually kind of creating this, the pilot project, that other people can learn from, right? And also another fun fact in terms of public engagement is, remember the mics that we have out there in the field, right? And remember the videos we have out there in the field, they webcast everything on real time, right? So you can actually log on to our website and actually check out what's happening in those webcasts. And actually, towards at the end of the lecture, I will try to play some of those for you, right? So you can actually know where to locate these things and how to use them. Those are extremely user friendly. So right in that image, actually, this is how the interface looks like, right? Let me actually get my pointer. This is how the web interface looks like, right? It's simply as simple as hitting a particular key, and I will demonstrate that actually on a website at the end of this lecture, right? So what you can see over here is actually we have already created some basic classes, right, that are likely for us to detect, right? And and it's funny, like, I mean, what the hell does a turtle doing here? They are not emitting sounds. Well, they hiss actually sometimes. When they go by a mic, when they hiss, we actually collect that weird hissing noise. So that's why they are there. And some of them are really funny, like like for the pets, we have this panda thing. And then so I will do a short demo on how you actually, use this DidSam system for public outreach works. Generally, the interface is pretty easy. So you hit play and let it sound. As you hear something, you pause it and pick one of the sound classes that are available. If there's a new sound class, you can actually even add a new sound class, right? On top of the sound classes we already have, right? And if you made a mistake, you can actually go back and delete it. So it's extremely easy to do, right? And even if you are not good at identifying any of these, right, animals particularly, right? I mean, when a bird call, right? As a bird call, cicada, right? And you can even like identify the this microphone noises, right? Or if something is questionable, you can do that. You can identify the sound of the rain or the wind, right? So any other background noise, human voices. So there are many there's quite a lot you can do, right? And I'm pretty sure you will get better at it as you learn. So here there's one of our collaborators setting up one of these monitoring stations right over there, right? And if you take a closer look at that, this is actually how one of those sensor systems look like. And then those are like the microphones, right, that we actually set up, and plus the processing board. There is some sort of processing and cleaning up going on at the site, and then that's kind of like what a unidirectional mic looks like. It kind of collects data not all around it, but like for a greater distance towards a particular direction, unidirectional, single direction, right? Up, what is happening here? Right. Now, so we actually, before we picked, a single, classification system, that is the convolutional neural networks, we actually tried many other different types of classification systems in isolation, like as solo systems, and then we also tried combining different systems, right? So there were several trial runs we did, because if you read the literature on what kind of artificial intelligence systems that we can use for soundscape analysis, there's so much out there, right? We cannot like unimaginable amount. So we ran all of those systems first, right? And then experimented with the local data, right? And then we actually, after all of that, we figured that convolutional neural network is actually in itself is kind of the best way to move forward. In fact, well, it's not in itself. That in combination with the expert classification is actually the best way, A, in terms of creating a self-learning, self-sustained AI system, B, reaching a high accuracy in identifying a whole sort of soundscape data. So did mention that there's training going on once in every 2 months, and largely we are trying to use locally collected data, because we are also realizing that the soundscape has some unique fingerprints that are locally tailored. So it may help earlier to train the AI system based on data collected from outside, but down the road, when you want to fine tune the training, you have to start using local data. So with each iteration, we are observing reduced classification errors and increased identification, right? And so again, we did see this particular system earlier in my system. This is kind of the hardware system, right? The different types of microphones, like you cannot tell them apart by looking at them. The way they live, way we install them are pretty much the same, right? And this is actually the kind of the box that does all the filtering, the initial filtering, cleaning up before emitting a Wi-Fi signal, right? And so here you are actually looking at the 4-tiered system that we are using, right? So at first, on the bottom tier over here, we are looking at sampling, right? There are some addition, some cleaning up, very initial cleaning up going on after the first recording them, right? And then through Wi-Fi or optic cables, it's sent to our central database, the server in MIT. And then at MIT, the AI again takes over, right? Going over different types of compilations, right? And also what we do is, like, so we have this kind of filtered cleanup, um, edited sample, right? And then also our recorders also directly, without any filtering, without any cleaning up, it also sends data to the actual AI, right? And then it actually goes through the rest of the workflow, right? Primarily, you know, we could be sending training data, right? So then it actually goes through the multi-tiered training process, and then, kind of re-editing the neural layers or neural classifiers, right? And then after the initial training, the actual, self paced analysis starts in, right? So it goes through. So we actually feed in the test data collected from Tidmarsh, right? And then it actually undergoes some streaming processes, right? And then undergoes multiple servers, and then ultimately to the actual analyzer that actually contains the neural classification, the multi-layered neural systems. And then we actually extract some of that, right, and send it through experts, right, to see how well the TIDSAM system, the AI, has done the classification, right, and then use that again to feed kind of do a recurrent training, right, on towards our AI, right. You can see these arrows going back this way, right. And then what happens is, another fraction of whatever that is been analyzed by the AI then that data all goes to the web interface where our web clientele, right, which also include both experts and citizen scientists, will actually use that for different purposes. And whatever leaves with the annotations, can then again, can be fed recurrently towards the streaming manager that actually manages and kind of helps retuning the neural network that we earlier described, right? So again, that's actually in a nutshell what our AI system is. And well, I showed you those pictures already. So that is actually the web link to TIDSAM, and I'm going to actually show you how this work. Right, I will add that part from actual web interface, right? And through the PowerPoint, if you download it, you can actually play this on your own too. It's kind of a demo of what's happening. So now what you are seeing is actually kind of a demo on what can actually happen over there, right? You may not hear the sound directly, but what you are looking at is how do you actually use this to classify, right? And you play this thing, and then when you pause when you hear something, right? And then you can actually even move back, right? Back and forth, stop, and then record what that is, right? And then also you can actually create, annotate new files, right? And you can actually even put a discussion point. So this is actually how the video camera system works, right? So video camera are also live streaming. They actually record animals as they move across the wave plane, right? And you can see it actually zooms into the actual animal, and even birds, right? Even when they're in motion, right? And they can actually like kind of seamlessly follow a moving animal, right? And in every second, it actually tries to identify it, while it's in its view plane. And you can also help the AI system to ID what those things are, right? You can say it's just a bird. That's good enough too, right? Or you can actually tell what bird exactly that is. Right? So, yeah, I just don't want to miss anything important here. Um, Again, so this is how those microphone systems work, right? And you can actually go into the web interface and click those microphones, right, with your mouse pointer, and then you can actually listen to them, hear what is happening. In fact, if you download my PowerPoint and play it, you will even get this audio file. I could not enable the audio file in my screen recording system. So you can listen to these things real time, right? And experience what's going on there right now, right? You could be miles away from Tidmarsh, but you can experience everything visually and through sounds, right? And you can actually even go back into the past, right? And you can actually move across different areas of the landscape, right? Kind of panning in and out, right? And technically every mic that is live, that is currently recording, that we haven't taken offline, you can play around them, right? And it actually, there's an automatic graphical display showing, what kind of activities are happening and where it is happening, right? um and it even tells your GPS location, right? Later on, if you want to go to that location, check it out, all you have to do is write down that GPS location. So I'm going to let it play. So in fact, when you see those raindrops, that actually indicates raining, right? Those water drops, that's actually, when it is raining, and I can actually hear the raindrops. And you can too if you download that particular PowerPoint. And you can see that these sonograms are, constantly moving, right? And you can actually hover over those different graphs and try to understand what each graph is plotting, right? So up there, it actually tells you, right, on a given day, right, in a given time, what kind of species we're vocalizing based on what has been already identified by the AI system and by the experts, right? So and over there you can see you can even download different data sets, right, for a particular day, or for a particular date, or for an entire year, or for an entire month, right? So, and also you can download it like onto your local computer, or you can actually work completely on the web browser as well, right? And right now over there, what it's actually detecting an airplane and wind, right? So you can clearly see any detection it makes, it actually translates that into a visual signature. Um, so we were trying to even like help out people with visual impairments, sorry, hearing impairments. um it's kind of how far technology can go, right? Again, another example of what we can detect in our soundscape systems. So I'm not going to actually wait and play around all of this. um when you download the PowerPoint, these videos are embedded so you can enjoy them on your own, right? um So I think this should be my one before the last slide. So you can see how the AI system tries to identify animals, right? Uh, See, sometimes it actually tells, oh, it's a vertebrate, and then ultimately says it's a bird, right? So, so it's pretty cool. Like some of these, so you can see the AI switching between vertebrate, placental, blah 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 blah, ultimately saying birds. Yeah, it's looks like a cormorant to me, but I don't think it was able to tell it was a cormorant. I think the closest it gotten was like saying a wading bird. So it's pretty cool. I think the visual signal is like the visual identification part is little further behind, but the rest of the things are actually spot on. Um, so the last one I want to mention is actually what we are presenting over here is using multiple sensors, right, to detect different types of elements of the landscape, right? We focus on the soundscape a lot, right? Most of the efforts that we have is to focus on the soundscape, right? Acoustic monitoring, right? And but we know that actually, with the technological advances, and as biologists, we wanted just more than the soundscape. So we want to consider soundscape as one of the survey techniques that can be used as a remote sensing device. But we need to connect that with other systems. So where we are going from here onwards, um, we are also in the process of working with USGS and UMass Amherst um, to actually use drone flights to collect more data, right? We actually have done some drone flights to collect data on wetland structure on a very limited part of the landscape. We want to broaden it, right? Use that for recording wildlife, right? And use that to access certain locations that we are not surveying right now. Like this includes a physical setup, but so certain ground areas are not stable to place our sensors, or it's physically inaccessible. So we want to use drone to record sounds, right, from these areas. That's going to be extremely challenging. Drones generate lots of sounds already, right? So you need some mechanism to filter off that drone sounds. And then we want to use a particular mechanism to actually, like you see over here, augment the sensors, right? Some of these wild landscapes are full of sound signals, but it's hard for us to detect them, even hard for us, some of our microphones, to detect them. So we want to actually develop a particular system that catches up very low frequency, low amplitude, low pitch sounds and enhance them, right? And we want to actually transport or transfer that one on real time with the enhancement to humans so that they can experience this, right? Particularly that will attract more tourists to our this particular habitat, and will like increase human intervention in conservation efforts, in restoration efforts. And also we want to actually make these energetically good, so that like it will so that we can depend more on solar radiation, and we are currently completely independent of actually piggybacking from the national grid. So we want to increase the energy sustainability of this system as well, right? And we want to actually go and actually mount cameras on substrates, on water, right, on ground, so we actually are not missing anything. Right now we are only sampling ambient sound, right? And we want to actually create kind of a 3D reality out of this, right? So someone who cannot physically access this habitat, from their classrooms or from their laboratories, can actually experience the soundscape and the visual signals, like kind of going through a virtual reality, kind of piggy bank, something like Google goggles, to experience what our landscape is. So we want to, what I'm trying to tell you is, we are trying to go just beyond just soundscape. We are trying to connect soundscape with the audio signals. Sorry, soundscape with audio signals, soundscape with video signals, soundscape with other physical and chemical measurements we make in the field, and also increase the user experience, right? No matter whether it's for recreational purposes, for educational purposes, or for scientific research, right? So please understand that this is actually not the end product. We are not even close to that, right? We are at best at like a second generation AI, right? Um, so we have a long way to go, and we have been successful quite well. And what you guys can do actually, if you're interested in this kind of stuff, is actually like sign up for the Tidmarsh component. Go to Tidmarsh. The web links are right over there, right? And experience what we have done. Um, and I hope you enjoy this talk. Bye bye.